So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the HRQ IDEAL Roundtable Capstone webinar. I'm your host, Sal Vergara with HRQ here in Dallas. Joining me today again is Mr. Brett Kierstead, our Chief Revenue Officer. So first off, Happy New Year. I hope you all had a great holiday. For many, 2020 was a new word that I came up with, me and my wife, a difficult year, a very tough and difficult year. But we're in the dawn of 2021 with lots of promise and opportunities, and we hope you glean some useful information in this conversation. Like all of our webinars, lots of our attendees today are current clients, so welcome those folks today. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, our parent company, Landrum HR, is a nationwide human capital services organization, and we offer full-service HR outsourcing or PEO services, worksite management and staffing solutions, and insurance. HRQ division conducts searches for top interim and full-time HR professional placements, ranging from recruiters all the way to CHROs. And we offer comprehensive HR consulting with our deep expertise in talent management and strategy, HR transformation, organizational design, workforce planning and analytics, and HR on call. So to give you guys on the phone some context of why we're even here today, I hosted 3 IDEAL Roundtables last year that provided a platform for Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officers to advance the dialogue revolving around inclusion, diversity, equity, and authentic leadership. IDEAL is the acronym. We anonymized and consolidated all of their comments, and as we created an executive summary, which all of you will receive just by virtue of registering for this event. And as you can imagine, trying to distill all that information, all that conversation was pretty daunting. All these folks you see on screen offered a lot of great feedback and some insight, but I think we really captured the essence of what the subject is about, some critical points that encapsulate the spirit of best practices and what they envision is needed for 2021. So I'm very fortunate to have some of the panel members here today with us. Not everyone could join, but very fortunate to have everyone. We have today Kim Arnold, former SVP of Talent Development and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Texas Capital Bank. She's now DE&I consultant as she's looking for her next new role. She's in transformation, as I would call it. We have Tina Bigalki, Global Chief Diversity Officer at PepsiCo. We have Dean Delpiche, Senior Manager, Talent Acquisition, Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Equity Strategy at Fiix Software. And Brett, we do have someone representing Canada, so the Dean's here for us. Nichelle Grant, Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Siemens USA up in Chicago. Soon, Allison Lyons will be joining us. She's Vice President, HR Business Partner Team at JP Morgan Chase here in Dallas. Randy Wilson, Vice President, Organization Development and Personal Growth at First United Bank. And then Yvonne Wolf, last but certainly not least, former Head of Human Resources, Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute. So welcome, everyone. Again, I'm honored and grateful to have you all here today. For those tuning in, if you have any questions or comments, please send those into us via the questions panel. Brett is manning that, and we'll farm those out to you. So there will be a quick poll on the screen. And if you can give us an idea as to where you are as it relates to your ID&E strategy, that would be great. So if you guys see that on your screen, please answer that poll question. We have a strategy in place and comfortable with what we have. We have a strategy in place, but we still need some guidance, and we have yet to start and not sure how to prioritize or begin. So as we're tallying the responses, I encourage you to connect with all of us, any of us here on screen via LinkedIn. Every registrant, as I mentioned, will receive the executive summary that I alluded to earlier. So if you have any questions or would like some guidance or support in building your ID&E team or developing an ID&E strategy, please reach out to me, reach out to Brett. We'll be more than happy to help you. So we are waiting for the results here from marketing. So, all right, so we have a strategy. We have 16% of the folks have a strategy in place and comfortable with what you guys have. 52%, more than half, have a strategy in place but still need some guidance, which is not uncommon. A lot bigger than I thought. 32% have yet to start and not sure how to prioritize or begin. So lucky for you, we've got some great experts and thought leaders in that space. That's what the conversation will revolve around. So that's a great segue into thematically on the executive summary that I referred to. Here are the key points that we gleaned from our roundtables. And you don't have to write this down. You don't have to remember it because it will be elaborated on in that executive summary that you'll be getting. Take action, assess, understand, and adjust. Be accountable. This is not a moment, but a movement. Let me repeat that. It's not a moment, but a movement. Commit to change. So once you start something, stay the course. You may have to recalibrate. You may have to restart over again. And then just real quickly, if anyone can put your phone on mute, we've got some feedback here. And then the last one, promote empathy, accountability, courage, and humility. So those are the 4 key points that we kind of the common denominators from the roundtable. So starting off with the first question, we'll get to it. What's your advice on getting started with an ID&E initiative, best practices, and or pitfalls to avoid? So I'm going to go around the horn here. Kim, what do you think?
So I've done when I've come into an organization where it was to still assess what is there in place. I've been in several companies where though it's not a formal program or D&I role, whether it is a leader that has women's panels or maybe an HR person has created some kind of D&I activity in their group, something may exist. And it's real important, I think, when you, especially if you're coming into an organization, either as a consultant or just joining, to honor and validate what is in place and then go from there. So, so a lot of other suggestions, but I'll start with that one and pass it on.
Randy, sorry about that. I'm on mute. That's the live thing about this thing. What do you think, Randy?
So I appreciate the question. I think for me, what I've found, having started some sort of I&D initiative over the course of my career, is the one time where we actually had it work right. We started with the why, right? We asked why, and the question was, why are you even interested in doing this? Are you checking a box? Are you feeling like it's the right thing to do? Are you feeling like that's the momentum, that's where things are going? Do you have a problem that you're trying to solve for? What is the why behind it? And I think if you answer the why, then you're giving yourself a great starting place to be able to build a foundation, right? Because you're not going to be building this for representation when the answer is actually about issues that you have going on in the organization around willingness and tolerance and acceptance of others, right? So asking yourself the why would be my first order of business.
Excellent. Nichelle?
Yes, thanks, Sal, for inviting me to the panel. Looking forward to this continued discussion. When I think about diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, I think what I would add to my other colleagues' comments is that it's aligned with business goals, right? It's not something separate from what you're trying to do as a business going forward. And I think you're going to find that as you start, there's some short-term, low-hanging fruit things that you can do, but you really got to stick to it for the long term, right? Meaning that long-term impact. And I would say also, though, what you do is important. So you can't do everything, but what you do is important so that you leave the business and the employees better and your customers better than you found them, right? One of the pitfalls, I think, is people kind of try to do everything, right? I think you need to meet the employees where they're at. Don't get frustrated. You got to stay the course, keep on message, and continuously communicate to your collective organization.
Absolutely. Underscore, commit to the change, stay the course, full transparency, good communication. Dean, how about you, sir?
Well, first of all, Sal, thanks for having me on the call, and thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, just to compliment my colleagues, I think one of the key things when we're looking at I actually use the acronym DIBE, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. I think when you're looking at doing something, one of the things that you need to reflect on is this is just not a nice HR thing that we're doing because it sounds good or hey, let's just squeeze in diversity under this department. No, I want to compliment when Michelle said that it's number one, a business outcome. Number two, the way I look at it is I look at it as an organizational change management strategy, where you're actually trying to accomplish systemic change within the organization so that every area and every function of your organization is layered with diversity, or inclusion, or belonging, or equity at the forefront. And so, I know we'll talk a little bit more about how to accomplish that. But similar to Randy, start with having the mind to do it, but also understand that this is not something you're going to do tomorrow and that's it. It's over and done with. It's something that takes time, and step-by-step progress is the best way to look at it.
Excellent. Yvonne?
Wow, how do you follow up on all this great insight? It looks like Allison has joined. I've spent my career largely in roles either as head of HR or head of talent, head of, OD. So not really as a D&I practitioner, but what I've always done is embedded D&I in the people strategy. So I have two best practices. One is really about really partnering really closely with the DEI experts and thought leaders like the folks on this panel, and the 16% that said they have a great strategy in their org. I think we should listen to them. And then one of my favorites, because I'm really fascinated by the whole neuroscience side of D&I, and how do we help people make the choice to be inclusive. And one of the ways I think is about examination. So do some real self-reflection about and learn a lot about who we are and our own biases and things like that, and the implications that has on our decision making. And then so that we move towards being inclusive versus it being something that we're told to do.
Yep. And as you mentioned, the 16%, also the 32% who aren't really sure because they haven't prioritized yet. This is just kind of underscores that it's okay. One thing that I learned from the past roundtables is that don't feel badly that you're not there yet. The fact that you're even doing something is the first step. So I wanted to make that point. Tina, what do you think?
Let me take myself off mute first. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. And Sal and Brett, thank you for inviting me to the panel. So I echo Yvonne's comments that you've already received a lot of really good advice on how to get started with the program. I guess I'll use my most recent experience because I too am new to the space with only 6 months or so in role and former HR positions. So I tried to put the problem to solve in terms that the business could understand. So at PepsiCo, we're a consumer goods company. And so I looked at our analytics as a share problem, meaning if workforce availability says one thing for women and other cohorts like Black, Hispanic, Asian, and we're not at workforce availability, that means we have a share problem because we're not getting our fair share of diversity through our doors. So I fundamentally started with the analytics. And I do agree with what others said that you should look at the analytics across your organization from not only your entry-level management, but up through your management ranks.
Good point. Good point. And for those that just logged in, and for Allison as well, the question was, what's your advice on getting started with an ID&E initiative, some of the best practices and pitfalls? Allison is here, and she's now legit provided us a Brady Bunch format here of people. So this is awesome. So Allison, what do you think? You're on mute there. Can you hear us, Allison? Looks like we might have lost her from a technical perspective. All right, we may come back. We will come back to Allison when she gets back the connection here. I'm glad Randy's on the phone here because my very first roundtable, I was very hesitant, reluctant to even have the roundtable to begin with. And some of the questions I thought were provocative. And when I made that statement, Randy said, Sal, these aren't provocative questions, they're necessary conversations. So anyway, I feel much more comfortable in the topic at hand. But, these questions are tough. And in all transparency, some of the folks that are on the phone now as attendees, the last virtual fireside chat I had with Michelle Grant, we're talking about this very topic of ID&E. Some of these questions are based on the questions asked of the attendees. And so I thought, what a wonderful way to kind of pass on these very meaty questions. So the first one, there's this notion that a lot of people not of color equate inclusion and equity to equality. And that has manifested in those folks getting upset with the ID&E efforts that create specific forums or employee resource groups that are only for people of color to share experiences. The question here is, are there ways that ID&E efforts, specifically from people not of color, can challenge each other to think differently about inclusion and equity? So, tough one. Since I mentioned Randy, what do you think, Randy?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think that there's a lot of layers to this question, right? So as thinking through it and how you might approach this, the top of mind, and usually if I start thinking about this, the first few things that come to mind are usually the areas where I want to deep dive a little bit into. So when you talk about, majority people or people who don't feel a connection to whatever that is around the ID&E, and some of the pushback that I've heard, right, throughout my career is, wait a minute, by creating this effort, are you not just separating out and creating more separation than inclusion around the effort? And there are several things to think about, and I'll try to I'll mention a couple. I think the first thing is the why around the idea of having separate groups, right? So why do you have a women's group? Why do you have an LGBTQ group? Why do you have an African American group, and so on? And I think part of the reason is that the cry for the initiative or the call out to actually do something is anchored in the idea that people in organizations who are not majority are looking for people who have had similar experiences so that they don't feel as though they are on an island and all on their own and trying to navigate through an organization and feel like they belong. Right. So a lot of times it's anchored around this notion of belonging. It's anchored around this notion of I don't see people who look like me, and I'm looking for a way to feel as though this is the right place for me or the right culture. So there's that part of it that answers the question for some people about why is it important to separate out, right? Now, what was new to me and new to my learning was around the time that George Floyd was killed, and most organizations went into action around what to do about this. And what was interesting about the George Floyd murder was that there was a tipping point for many people around the world around, the things that happened to African Americans at the hands of the police. And most people, if they didn't already know this, they felt as though this was something that was new to them. And I think what we saw that was different in the I&D space was that most organizations, and I started to ask around, what were people doing about this and what was happening? What I was hearing was a lot of organizations were bringing people to these forums to talk about their experience and to talk about what this meant to them. And it was the first time that I can recall where there was a collective need for all people of all backgrounds to come together to talk about this issue, right? So that precipitated this notion that being in a collective had value, right? Not being separated out, but being in the collective brought value. But there has to be, I think, that kind of effort with the understanding that there are still people who are hurting and people who need to have an opportunity to be able to feel in a very safe space that they can talk about the issues that are very real to them in a workplace environment. And so for people who are of the majority, that may not have even hit their radar, right? They may not even be thinking about this idea that separation actually is creating a safe space so people can bring their whole selves in and feel as though they're a part of something greater.
Definitely. That's a lot to unpack, and we can obviously go on tangents of dissecting that a little bit more, which we might here in a little bit. Kim, same question. Are there any ways that ID&E efforts, specifically from people not of color, can challenge each other to think differently about inclusion and equity?
Right. So, when you think about the if you get a reaction of resistance or concern about, the employee resource groups, I think Randy did a great job of saying one voice of concern is that, well, aren't these dividing us and not being inclusive, right? I think another voice of concern that I've heard is that there's a sense that there's only limited resources in an organization, and these certain populations now are taking some of the resources in an attempt to level the playing field or whatever. So there's this feel that once you take something or you give something to somebody, that means you're taking something from me. And so it is something that I've heard often voiced throughout my career, specifically from white males, that, we don't have a group, or, there's a lot of leaders spending time with these employee resource groups or this population. And so the way that my husband and I were talking about this morning at breakfast, and he's biracial, and he kind of said, well, I'll just tell them to talk to my grandfather about equity, right? And I think the response I want to give, is often to scold or preach. But what I have found that works is when there's that question or resistance about why are they getting something now that me as a white male or, not getting is, I think the three things I look at is communicate, anticipate, and educate is how I say it. So communicate is when you're launching these things from the beginning, it's real important that you communicate it well. This is case for why we have these groups. And I think, Randy, you had some amazing points to talk about the importance of, the populations coming together. But then no matter how well you launch it, my anticipate is you have to anticipate there's going to be questions or concerns or resistance to this. And you have to listen to them. You have to be willing to understand what is behind that. And what I've encountered is that there may be somebody that had an experience where they feel like when an organization brought in a big diversity, equity, inclusion effort, that then them as a white male were no longer seen as, promotable. And they felt like they lost opportunity. They felt like things were taken from them. So I think it's important to understand that was their experience, and that's, a concern of theirs. And then I think the educate, it's two things. One is, I think you have to build an understanding. So many of us, as we grew up, we were not taught history like we should have been. We were not taught Black history like we should have been. And, I share my experience, with my colleagues around the things that I learned over time, having grown up actually in a primarily Black area and gone to school, a Black school. We weren't taught Black history. And so as I've really started to learn and then understand how the inequities came about and how these racial constructs were constructed and what exists and the inequities that we created, only then when I kind of grew my understanding was I really then, became more passionate about we have to build more equity within the organization and we have to deconstruct these. And so part of this education is around, I think, the historical education. But I also think that over time you have to build trust where people will realize that this is not about taking things from people. This is not being unfair to you. I find that sometimes you do the education through large groups, but sometimes it has to be one person at a time, and being really transparent and sharing some of my own experiences with evolving and learning. And it's in one hand, I'm able to do this because being, a white now, I'm able to kind of have this conversation and talk about my whiteness and being white and white privilege in a different way. So that's kind of been my experience.
Okay, I think the common theme that you say there, which I think should be applicable just across the board, especially with this topic, is just transparency and communication and not being reluctant or hesitant to have those difficult conversations, or it could be deemed difficult. So Thank you for that. Allison is back with us. And so if we can go back to the first question that we initially asked, so we can get her feedback. What's your advice on people getting started with their ID&E strategy? Allison, there's about 32% of the attendees who don't know where to start. They don't know how to prioritize. So what are some of the best practices and pitfalls?
You bet. Can you hear me okay, Sal? Great. My apologies, everyone. We have a bit of a tough firewall in the banking system, so my apologies for the difficulty. I think the main thing to really consider is, first of all, ensuring that your senior leadership team is truly on board and supportive of all of it. I've had the fortunate opportunity to work in a lot of great organizations who really are well-intentioned and want to do the right thing, but you really can ensure that there won't be success if your senior leadership team isn't comfortable with the why, and if they don't recognize and understand that by developing and starting this journey, that organizationally, there's so much to be gained, but you have to make sure that they're on board first. It's not an easy journey. I've been in organizations. I'm currently at JP Morgan Chase, which is incredibly out front and progressive in ways that I have never seen, and it's been absolutely exciting. But I've also been in organizations that are not comfortable. So I think the first piece of it is getting on board, sharing the why, sharing the details around why this matters, that the generation that is coming up, my children are 14 and 9, and those that are in their early 20s, that this is an expectation. I had the opportunity to work with our analyst program, so they're up and coming 21 and 22-year-olds, and being on a panel with them. And it was literally the week of all of the social unrest. And the first question that they asked us was, well, what are you doing? And the fascinating thing is that it wasn't employees that were of color. It was these were people who were white and other and Asian. They were not folks who were African American or Hispanic. And so that's an expectation of generations to come. And so I think the first piece is talking with your senior leadership, explaining the expectation and your attraction, and then really ensuring that they are comfortable with the conversations that have to come on board with this discussion. You have to be willing to take a look at your current, where are you in the diversity journey? Are you diverse at your senior leader levels, or are you very diverse in entry level areas? And then really show the business case as to what happens when diversity occurs, such as boards are more that are more diverse tend to have 100% more in terms of percentage-wise, where they have a much better business result. Showing the attraction component. So really making the case with the data as to why this matters. That sometimes helps move folks who have a really good heart, but they're worried about the uncomfortable conversations that come with it. And so I think that's the first piece, is really sharing that. And then finally, once you've kind of gotten your team on board, is really bringing your employees along. I think Kim makes a great point that if you don't bring your employees, I've had it where the top senior leadership teams are very comfortable, but their direct reports aren't there yet, then you also can struggle. And so it's sharing and out front with your employees as to why we're doing this, that this is not about a journey that you're going to have less qualified folks, or kind of nailing those stereotypes that we don't often want to talk about. We're still going to get top caliber employees. We just want diversity of thought, in the same way that we'll be more successful. Many an organization has made a misstep because what everyone in the room looks the same, and didn't recognize or see blind spots that are out there in the world that can really harm the organization. So I think it's sharing that kind of feedback that really can get the business leaders on board, and then your employees, so it doesn't become to them. And I've been there, where I was in an inroads, an internship program 25 plus years ago, and someone said to me, is this some affirmative action thing? Because the business that I'd worked at that time hadn't really sold what this was. That I was still considered a top performer among any ethnic group, but this is just happened to be one of the vessels that I utilize that for. Because if you don't have those conversations up front, then your employees get that, and then it ends up not being a success, because either those employees quickly get what they want about it and they leave and they're not ambassadors for you, or the organization just doesn't get the buy-in.
Yep, great points. Any comments or questions before we move on? Thank you very much for the contributions thus far. All right. So the next question I have actually is a good segue, or the previous question was a good segue into this next question. And some of you kind of answered it, but it's asked in a different manner. Lots of companies have established ID&E committees, employee resource groups last year, obviously because of what happened. Some have commented that this has created a sense of segregation between those that are initially part of the committee and the rest of the company, particularly when it comes to race. it had inadvertently created division versus inclusion. So what have you done, or your organization, or would you suggest to ensure the entire organization feels comfortable and compelled to participate in an ID&E initiative? So a little bit of the same question, but what have you actually done or suggest that people do? Let me start off with Tina, please.
Okay, so hey, I'll give a couple of suggestions here. We at PepsiCo have had employee resource groups for many years, and in an effort to ensure that not only the employee resource groups work together, but also, we don't exclude anybody from information. We did something a little bit unique a couple of years ago, and it seems to really be taking off, where what we would do is 3 times a year, we would have either career or leadership seminars that are sponsored by an ERG where everybody is invited. So, and it's more of a multicultural event where people get either information on, how to further their career, leadership skills, etc. And we have one of the ERGs sponsor it, and then we have, webinars throughout the companies for everybody to join. And it really solves 2 problems for us. One is, it creates more of a sense of unity where, all are welcome to this event. And the second problem that it solved for us at PepsiCo is we kind of had ERGs going off doing their own career development seminars and their own leadership seminars that potentially were not quite aligned with our overall leadership philosophy at PepsiCo. And we wanted to make sure that, people got consistent information on what our expectations were of leaders and how to grow your career, et cetera. So we kind of combined the forum and had the ERG sponsor the event, but, everybody gets the same PepsiCo information in the event.
Excellent. Thank you. Dean, what have you guys done there, Fiix?
Yeah, no problem. So, our journey started about 3 years ago, to be honest with you. And it started us first becoming a B Corp certified organization. And if you're not familiar with B Corp, I encourage you to look it up. It's really an accountability standard for companies globally in order to produce metrics on a variety of different issues such as social impact and sustainability, corporate social responsibility, and diversity and inclusion. And so for the last couple of years, we've been what's happened is we've been providing metrics on our organization to stay B Corp certified. And last year, what ended up happening is we recognized that wasn't enough for us. And so what we did is we went through the process of actually creating an actual organizational change model for the organization. And what that did was we produced an actual living document, which is what we call our diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity strategy. It has about 16 different areas that we want to move the dial in terms of targets. So, for example, recruitment, for example, if we want to, let's just say, for example, our current employee base is, 60% male, 30 or 70% male, 30% female. If we want to move the dial to 40% over the next couple of years, it lays out how we're going to do that in a very succinct way. And so we have about 16 different areas that we have in order to do that, and one includes, to Tina's point, ERGs and how ERGs will be moving the dial. The point being is, I think that the issue in the past has been, let's do a Black History Month celebration, let's do a Pride event and celebrate, or let's do this, or let's do a program, but we haven't really taken the time to really say, okay, how do we really align this to the business strategy, as Allison was kind of mentioning, and how do we ensure that every layer of our organization is truly on board with everything that we're doing, so that when, to Tina's point, when we have an ERG, people understand, hey, our ERG might be focused on, the African diaspora, but it doesn't mean that I can't come, because I'm going to come and I'm going to learn and be educated when I go, and et cetera, in all of our EIGs. And so that's kind of the process, Sal, that and everyone online that we've been kind of going through. It's really been is ensuring that from the board level down, that there's change effected within the whole organization. You're muted, Sal.
Thank you, sir. As you're responding, something came to mind, especially since you're in Canada, and for companies like Siemens, who's global, PepsiCo, and you, Dean, are there any things that you've seen, Dean, like in Canada, that is being done differently? And also for Nichelle and for Tina, from a global perspective, have you had to customize the approach based on where you are, juxtaposed to what's being done here in the States, or is it a consistent process or policy? I'm just curious from your perspective of leading those from a global standpoint, how does that look?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I'm going to start with this. I think, depending on your location, you have to customize your strategy to your location, because every, local marketplace has different demographics, let's say. So for example, in Toronto, where I'm located, when we look at our demographics in Toronto, we have about 51.5% racialized individuals in our market. And so, for example, other people in other markets, it might be completely different. And so now, for example, some of the things that we've had to change is as simple as our messaging. We don't use the term visible minority anymore, because racialized people are not the minority. They're actually the majority. And so we use the term racialized, right, to represent. And I think that could be adopted, right, anywhere you go. But this is something that we've had to change for our local marketplace. So it comes down to as simple as messaging. So I believe that when we're looking at these efforts, it definitely has to have a customized view, although there's a lot of parallels in North America. Now, when you're looking globally, there's different regulations on how you do different things in terms of collecting data. For example, in the EU, when you're using the GDPR, it's completely different. There's so many different things that you have to pay attention to. And so, yeah, I think, and this kind of goes back to something that I think I really want to say, back to kind of the whole, as much as, I respect and love my HR brethren, if you don't mind me saying this, I strongly believe that you still need someone in the organization who has some form of diversity acumen to really, really understand the depths of what's going on from compliance and different issues across the board when we're looking at equity throughout. And so that's if that's long-winded, Sal, I apologize, but that's a little bit overweight.
No, that's great. That's great. Thank you for that. And while I have you, I'm trying to go back here with some questions. Someone would like for you to restate the organization reference as a standard for metrics.
Sorry, restate the organization standard?
Someone would like for you to restate the organization that you referenced as a standard for metrics.
Oh, B Corp. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yes, B Corp.
B Corp.
Yes.
Got it. Perfect.
Yep.
Another question here, just for those, we're using acronyms that not everyone will know. ERG, employee resource groups. So different employee resource groups that are created for specific populations, demographics within an organization. And so the idea here is that you create an employee resource group specifically for Black folks or LGBTQ, and the idea here, the notion is that creates divisiveness versus equality. So that's what ERG is. And I'll be transparent, it wasn't until just not a few years ago that I didn't know that acronym either. So that's a good question. And then one more thing, someone suggested people equate DE&I with affirmative action. So does anyone have any comments with that comment? I know this
Sal,
is off script.
If you can hear me there, I was going to add the groups that I work with are global, and so they're in the UK, they're in Asia, they're all over the world, and there's definitely, like, many, for example, the U.S. uses racial as a way to deal with attract diversity. The UK and others, they use, they're looking at females closer. There's different pieces. And so we adapt to what is the area in those areas. But one way that we tackle people seeing diversity and inclusion the same as affirmative action is we have been very, I have often in my career been very specific about giving the background, particularly when you have a global group. People don't necessarily recognize, and we assume that they know some of the history with different groups of color. So for example, many people don't realize that up until mid 60s, early 70s, you could make a decision to discriminate against someone based on what they look like legally. And that there were some real structural racism pieces around like redlining that certain areas were not loaned to. And that's where those particular groups, for example, for African Americans, were not able to accumulate wealth. And so we've used that discussion as a way to talk about, this isn't an affirmative action. This isn't just giving people perceive affirmative action some sort of a way of giving someone something that someone else doesn't have. It's just more opening the door. Same qualifications are there, same expectations, in some cases maybe even more for that person of color. But this is a way of opening up, for example, your circle might be small. The people that you interact with might be people that look like you, go to school like you. This is our way of opening up the door to broader experiences. And so by sharing some of that historical perspective about why we have some of the structural racism pieces in place, most folks don't realize that. I personally experienced that when I was a child, when we were looking for a home that a real estate agent was trying to get us to build and move into a very specific neighborhood because they were not comfortable with African Americans in that area in Wisconsin. And so that's very real to me. I have very specific examples that I share with my business group leaders around that, and we share that globally. And then that helps get folks on the same page to understand why we're doing it, particularly maybe even over-indexing in certain groups that have had some challenges. And then also helps understand that this isn't about picking one group and then excluding others. This is about same qualifications, same expectations. Maybe we're just going to go past Yale or Harvard or those areas, or we're also going to include HBCUs or other groups that maybe historically weren't part of those conversations. And that's kind of really our way of opening up the dialogue. But when people find out the historical pieces around that in some neighborhoods it wasn't even legal to sell a home to an African American, they're shocked. This was like in my parents' generation. This was not that long ago. And then there's some country clubs that just opened up access to people of color in the last 20 to 25 years, within maybe most folks' lifetime that's working. So by sharing that history and that background and then talking about it in terms of that structural piece, it lends itself to not being about certain groups and affirmative action, but it lends it to be just we're opening up the spigot to everyone.
Thank you for addressing that. And again, if you've got questions or comments like that, please feel free to put those in the questions panel. Next question, not unless anyone has any added comments or questions yourselves. With 2020 in the rearview mirror. Yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to jump in on the global approach. Much of my career has been global as well. And one of the best practices that I recall and best experiences that I had was at Novartis. And one of the things, we were like in 600 countries and, you know, hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. And so to your point, the complexity was there. But what we did is we set a standard on outcomes. So it was more around everybody needs to be creating a culture of belonging. Everybody needs to be thinking about how this is going to improve your access to healthcare or whatever your business measure was. And then we allowed each division to establish their own how to get there. And so the connection was more around the outcomes that we wanted to have. And we came together annually to discuss our various strategies and our best practices, so we shared across the system. And to Dean's point, it was actually a partnership with, HR as well as with the GM as well as with the D&I head. So it was a really nice shared responsibility for helping with strategies.
Excellent. Michelle, do you have any feedback with that, and particularly with Siemens? And before you answer that, I can't remember if that was you, the last panel, where some company said that they went abroad and they used an outside source to give an objective perspective of what their ID&E strategy was. I can't remember who that was, but anyway, would love to get your feedback as well as Tina's.
Yes,
you know,
we had, okay, go ahead. To build on that, though, yes, that was part of the Novartis strategy, too. We brought in thought leaders to vet our strategies. So people like Frans Johansson, who wrote The Medici Effect, and there was a speaker from, you know, South Africa. And so our strategies had to be vetted by thought leaders. So apologize. Sorry about that, Michelle.
No problem. Yeah, you know, Sal, you know, being a global organization, in fact, we just had a call about this yesterday. We have established across the globe some foundational things that we all kind of build off of, and then regionally, right, whether you're in Canada or the US or in Asia or somewhere, regionally, you can attune it to what makes sense within your particular regions, right? And when you do it that way, at least we're all working off the same foundational information. Now, even within the US, though, I'm finding that if somebody's in California versus in Ohio, we still have to think through some nuances, even from state to state. And so it doesn't just go away because we all have the same, you know, sheet music, right? There's little different variations of it along the way. But being global, I think it's important that way because people see Siemens, they don't really know all the different ways that we're sliced and diced right behind the scenes. And so it's important we kind of have a united message and consistent message across the globe because our customers are across the globe.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey,
Tina,
Sal,
anything from yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add that a little bit on our global approach. So I'll just take a step back for a minute and say at PepsiCo, we have made several external commitments that we to the marketplace and to our shareholders that we follow very strictly. And the first was in 2016, where we said we wanted to have 50% females in our management ranks by 2025. That's a global commitment.
Wow.
And then in 2020, with with what we saw with the calls for social justice, particularly in the U.S. but around the globe as well, you know, all the inequities that were brought forward, by COVID, we took a step back and developed a second set of commitments that we call our racial equality journey. And the framework for those commitments is not only internal, but it's external as well for our communities. And it has three key planks. The first is, the three planks are people, business, community. So the first plank is really internally and making sure that we have internal equity within PepsiCo amongst our groups. The second is our business plank, and it's to ensure that we're driving equity in our business decisions. So with supplier diversity, with our brand, making sure that we have representation in our brand. So as an example, we have commercials with Doritos and Gatorade where we made sure that we've had like Black and Hispanic creatives on those brands. So our decision, are we equitable in our business decision making? And then the third pillar is within our communities, and it relates to what we're doing to uplift communities. And we've committed over $550 million in the U.S. to uplift communities, particularly in the areas of Black restaurants, Black and Hispanic restaurants and businesses. So we're working with those businesses to make sure that they have access to capital, digital tools needed to help with delivery, since not a lot of people are sitting in restaurants anymore. And with that, we took the approach in the U.S. and kind of made it global, same global framework, but very local. And I kind of call it it's like 2+1 approach, meaning that every country has to ensure that they're meeting the commitment for women, and that we're making progress toward being, 50% females in manager positions. Every country is making progress toward creating an inclusive environment, an environment of belonging. So every country does that. The +1 is very unique to the country's environment. So as an example, we have a lot of work in Brazil going on right now, particularly with the Black population that's typically underrepresented. in Australia, the indigenous population. Now, certainly every country can do more than the +1, but we tried to give each country, kind of a global framework, but with local flexibility to do what they need to in their environment to not only create equity within within PepsiCo, within our four walls, but also in the communities that we serve to make sure that we're supporting underrepresented communities around the globe.
Yep, and I think it's important to point out that the basic tenets of this initiative is applicable both global and domestic, but there's certain tweaking that you guys have articulated. One thing I know Brett has a question for you guys, but Tina, you mentioned women, and just before I forget, for those of you on the phone, the next series of IDEAL Roundtables will revolve around allyship, and so if that's something that resonates with you, I know it resonates with the panel. Whether you're a woman or a man who is a proponent and advocate for allyship, I encourage you guys to stay tuned for the next round of IDEAL Roundtable sessions. That's what we're going to tackle. So you reminded me when you mentioned that. So anyway, Brett.
Yeah, this is a tricky question, though, I think, for this group, but a really good one. This panel is made up of very high-level people at very senior and large organizations that clearly have visibility. But a lot of the people on here, one of them, for example, she's an evangelist, but she works with a 30-person company in a small little neck of the woods. And she's like not intimidated by the group, but like, wow, I don't have all these resources. I don't have ERG, but I want to make a difference and I want to start. So for the small business warriors out there, that won't have all these wonderful resources, but what do you guys suggest to them? And you could just, whoever got the passion for it can answer it. Go ahead, Randy.
So what I would say to the group is this. I have had big company experiences. I've worked in Bentonville, Arkansas. I've worked, as a consultant for some big branded names. And in the diversity and inclusion space, I've had to start initiatives. So I appreciate all the comments that the global organizations made about the DE&I and in a global context and all of that. I love, Tina, I love your idea of +1. I mean, those are all great things. Now I work at a bank that's a regional bank in 2 states that has 1,700 employees, and most of them are located in rural situations. And these are this is a community bank, right? So it's a one-stop shop. And what's so very interesting about this DE&I effort in the small organizations is that you're not going to have a critical mass of momentum that you could just say, hey, we're going to have a Black History Month awareness event that you're going to get a whole group of people, even if you kind of do this through a WebEx or something, or some sort of a web-based technology where you can have hundreds of people show up. What you're going to have is probably a handful of people show up. So what was interesting, and a little bit of what I learned, right? I took sort of that big company mindset about what you have to do to create structure around a process for DE&I, and I came to this bank and I put that in place, and everyone was so excited. And at the end of those meetings, when people were raising their hands to get involved, it was like nothing happened, right? And you thought, wow, there was so much energy and so much momentum. Why did nothing happen? And the reason nothing happened is because people didn't know what to do, right? And also in small banks, you don't have a lot of resources. And by the way, I raised my hand and I said I had experience doing this. And they said, okay, you lead it. Okay, well, what kind of resources am I going to have? Well, not going to work, right? We're not going to put any resources behind it. And oh, by the way, to Dean's earlier point, I work in an OD capacity in an HR function, and my manager said to me, Randy, you don't want this to be an HR initiative, right? Because that's not the way this is going to work, right? So you have to be behind the scenes, sort of the wizard behind the curtain doing all the work, and then you have to have some volunteers raise their hand who are going to be the poster faces, if you will, right, of the faces of this initiative. And they're not going to know what to do, but they're going to need to be out there and you're going to need to guide them. So for those companies that are starting and they're new and there's not a lot of knowledge within the organization, there's got to be some level of experience and knowledge about what to do. And you're going to have to rely on those resources to do 90% of the work, right? And it's going to have to be about the getting people to show up and getting people to say, I want to learn, and getting people to say, I want to be involved. But the biggest hurdle that you're going to have to get over, it's almost the analogy that I use in the organization. It's like trying to start a propeller plane, right? And you kind of pull the propeller down and you go, whoa, and then the propeller stops, and you got to pull it again, and then it goes and it stops. And then eventually it'll go on its own, right? But it's got to get, the juices flowing and things have got to get going. And that requires that one person or that small group of people that are going to do the lion's share of the work in the very beginning.
Thanks, Randy. And as I kind of underscore, go ahead. Who wanted to talk?
So I was just going to add to this. I've been in a range of organizations, super fortunate to work at JP Morgan Chase, $30 billion towards racial justice issues, giving money for mortgages, loans, all of that. It's an incredible place that's doing all of these great efforts. But I've also been at places that in healthcare in particular, where money's tight, it's governmentally regulated, no dollars, small. But in all cases, the theme across the board was having people see what's in it for me. And so I think we've had a year unlike any other. And so I think if there's any time that you could be in a small organization to get buy-in for a greater world, I think it's now in terms of what's happened around the world. And it's just getting like folks together to talk. Maybe we've doing focus groups. When I was in some small organizations, we had some focus groups. We did some things that were in common. We found some small charities that people could get behind that maybe had a more diverse background. People love children. We did things like underprivileged children, building bikes. And by building some of those, that momentum and that community and that spirit, then kind of led more into a D&I discussion, because people could see we're more connected in their local communities and people that they knew. And then you could start getting broader around the big dollar things that I get to see. And so that's kind of where I would start in those local rural communities. Often rural communities often have diverse populations. People don't even realize that, and start kind of honing in there, particularly in the South, you'll see that. And you can hone in there and then kind of build broader.
Yeah,
thank you.
Just add to that, Sal, if you don't mind for a minute.
Yeah, of course.
Like kind of small company experience as well. And sometimes it's just a matter of starting where you are. Meaning if there are a group of employees who want to kind of spark momentum, then start there. And similar to Allison's experience, we started with community involvement to really get people to know each other outside of the workplace. In one case, we did something as simple as we had a couple of employees who had children with disabilities that were differently enabled, and we just put together a pamphlet of resources for anybody in the workplace who wanted it. I mean, this is like really simple stuff. And that prompted a discussion of other people who had family members in similar situations, and they're in, a group of people connected around a certain topic. In another company I worked with, we simply for, LGBTQ just put, this is back when we had offices, most places don't have offices anymore, but we just put like safe space, in front of our office so that people knew if they had, a concern or they kind of wanted to come out and didn't know what to do, they knew that you would at least listen to them. And that again created community. And it was, they were pretty simple actions that you could take.
I have one more suggestion. Be a great curator of all the open content that exists out there. If you want to try to build a business case to invest in, inclusion and diversity, you don't have to hire a consultant to help you do that. There are resources out there. There's articles, there's webinars, there's things that are free right now for you. So you just have to be able to curate and find them. If you feel like you want to bring something to your leaders around inclusive leadership, I guarantee you there's free stuff out there, for you. So you just have to be able to curate it and bring it in. Don't feel like you have to design and build everything on your own or have someone do that for you. Even when I've been in larger companies, my strategy to things has always been borrow, build, and buy. So I'm going to borrow from the open market first and, leverage those things, and then, work at building some things internally. And only after that will I go buy and, and spend money on this stuff. You don't have to.
This is exactly the reason why I get all these people together. They're like a warm blanket that just reassures you that even though you don't have anything started yet, you just got to start. And it's okay
Can I add
to
to you, Sal?
recalibrate. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, you know what? It's just a light point, and then you can go forward. Listen, I think everybody's points were fantastic. I think the only thing I'm going to add is, be so excited about the fact that you're in a 30-person company and you don't have all the red tape to go through, right?
Yep.
So get super excited about that. You could start adding a difference where people are just where you could probably just communicate directly to your C-level leaders easily and be like, hey, I think these ideas would really, really fly. So I just want to encourage you, if you had a mindset that thought, hey, I don't know what to do or whatever, just change your mind thinking, I'm so excited. We've got a great opportunity to do something great.
That's a great point, Dean. And Brett and I have history together, and we've worked for small startups. And part of the allure to all that in smaller companies is the ability to do trailblazing, to kind of set your own tone. You don't have to worry about legacy ways of thinking. But that's a great point, because that is an opportunity for someone or a group of folks to kind of lay the groundwork and set the narrative of where they want their employer brand to go. A very good question, and thank you very much for all that feedback. That was awesome. Someone have a question?
Yeah, I just want to
Okay.
make a comment. When I think back to history, we started out with one employee resource group maybe 10 plus years ago. And so over time, it built to be what it is today. So it wasn't like overnight, we just built it and it was there. And we had to fight all along the way for people, resources, funding, and that never stops. And so even though we're talking like, we got a global, focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, don't be fooled. We started very small, right, with just a few people that had a passion for something and made it big. Just like with small or big, you still have to start where you can. And like Dean said, man, if I only had 30 people to deal with, and everybody say, hey, let's do this tomorrow, and say yes, that would be great. So leverage that while you can, because those people can take what you're providing them elsewhere as they move along through their personal and career.
Yeah, definitely. And whoever asked that question, the 30-person question, look at all the dialogue you just started. Go ahead, Brett.
I was going to say one thing, Michelle, you said on the last was, don't be discouraged if there's a few people that aren't on board yet. Like, don't let them take you off path. You're not going to get 100% adoption on day one, but that's no reason to stop.
I love right.
Precisely.
Yeah, the day where everybody's on board. Everybody won't ever be on. Work with what you got, and those passions. It'll be contagious, right? So.
Absolutely. A good question just came in, guys. How to start a focus group or groups that would be inclusive. So how do you create and use them and examples of their influence? So how do you create focus groups that are inclusive, and what are some examples of how they can influence the organization? That's just a random question to anyone. That was asked from our audience.
I think I can help with that, Sal. So one of the areas that I've seen in multiple organizations that I've worked in is by creating just a community of people that are interested. So just kind of putting it out there. So there are a lot of unspoken conversations. And I think one of the things that's happened over the last year, and I felt really fortunate to work somewhere that really spent a lot of time and effort developing manager support systems and toolkits so that they could have conversations when the racial injustice situation occurred over the summer. And one of the things that was really helpful was we just literally reached out and said, managers, here are some examples about how to have some difficult conversations. There's nothing that you need to do but listen. Take this to your team meetings and talk and just have a dialogue. We first were encouraged as leaders to share our stories. And by sharing those and opened it up to others. And then after those discussions, we then started having kind of breakout sessions with folks who were kind of common folks that wanted to take and do something about it. And then in all of these different departments, and that created We certainly have a framework of things that the organization provides, but there is an ability to customize based on line of business. We're 250,000 employees across the globe. And so obviously what happens in one part of business is in another, and you can have businesses that are like their own companies. And so that dialogue, that initial here leaders, here are some conversations, here are some books that you can read, maybe have your whole group. Like I led a book discussion. We had a book. We had over a month. I went in and got notes around the book and then just led discussions with folks. And interestingly enough, I was the only African American in that group. The folks that were from small towns had very different experiences. And we had a rich dialogue and found we had tons of things in common, which on the surface we didn't. And then we used people that after those discussions that were interested to then build this is a community that's really interested in taking this forward. And then we literally have broken it down into kind of focus groups. I'm doing this one of my groups now, like one on workforce, one on recruitment, one on hiring. And then we're taking that and we're putting parameters in place around that about what that could look like. Does that mean that you have a person of color? You might decide on all of your panels if you have that luxury, or does it look that you try to have a diverse slate? I know many organizations are really attempting to do that, putting metrics in place. But it started out with communities of people that had a shared interest, and then kind of building from there. And so that's a really simple way, to start with pop cultural conversations or books, or if you don't have folks who don't have time to have books. I'm the mom of a teenage and an elementary student. There's not a whole lot of time often for reading. An Audible did it for me. So we suggest where you can get an Audible, or here's a video for 30 minutes. We even did that for one of our employee resource courses. We had people come to this course. We had videos. We broke on Zoom into small groups on Zoom, and then we had a dialogue around in that creative community. And then again, who wants to do more of this work and do more of it in our organization? So you can create communities and then kind of build from there.
Excellent points. Yep.
I'll add to that. I think one of the things we found was the best practice is to focus on the topic and the why and the benefit, and not necessarily who's hosting it. Because a lot of times when we say, our WINS ERG is going to host a focus group on X topic, people already kind of got their, I'm not a woman, so I can't go, right? But if we say, hey, we're going to open a focus group on this topic and kind of downplay, right, who's hosting it and who's putting it together behind the scenes, you get a lot more people engaged across your organization. One thing I would say, if you're trying to hold a focus group around race, right, and racial justice and trying to get some different perspectives, one of the things we wanted to do is make sure that our managers were comfortable with having that conversation. A lot of them were uncomfortable because they're like, well, I don't know everything. How can I possibly have that conversation? So we armed them with the right tools and answers to questions. And like she was saying, Allison was saying, was about resources that they could read up on so that they would become more comfortable where their go-to experts. We paired them with a coach. You maybe recall me saying in an earlier conversation, we paired them with a coach so that they weren't by themselves while they had this focus group and this open discussion. Just wanted to add to what Allison was saying.
That's a great point.
May I add a comment too?
I think that's key that you do have that, but we also said no one's an expert. What we're experiencing, no one's an expert in. And all people really want to do is know they're being heard. And so here's the kid who are obviously there's things we don't want you to say, but for the most part, it was just around let's have a dialogue, let's have a discussion, share your feedback. It's about building community, and then you can build from there. So I totally agree with you on that, Michelle.
And Dean, right before you provide your feedback, Allison, you mentioned something about metrics. We can go off on a whole new tangent and a whole new call about that, but I think it's important to point out that if you don't have metrics set, it's extremely important. And some of these organizations that have been on the panel have some really sophisticated metric systems of how to measure all this. So what's the saying? What gets measured gets done. So if you don't have that, make sure that's in your prioritization of your strategy is getting a metric system to measure all this. Dean, you had something to add?
Yeah, no, because just the whole concept of focus groups is completely interesting. Quite quickly, in the past, what we were doing is we were having kind of like an annual inclusion training or diversity training, and we still do have several trainings that we do. But one of the things that we noticed is that, people would go through training and then 2 weeks later they kind of forget what they learned and go back in their lives. And so we implemented a software called Crescendo. And what that does is it actually sends, people in education and information on topics that have to do with diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. It could be articles, videos, and you can set it however you will. And so what we did is we added to that a focus group every month called Crescendo Conversations, where we'd invite up to 15 people or so to join this call, this call or this conversation, and we just take a topic from Crescendo. Maybe it was on white privilege, or maybe it was on anti-Black racism, or whatever it is, and people would just kind of come and they would kind of speak to their thoughts on it. No one came as an expert. We just kind of came and we all shared, and we really rallied around it. But then what we did is we got the ERGs involved by having ERGs lead some of these conversations. And what that did is it opened up a door where people, who would typically not go to a conversation with the LGBT group, now that they're leading these conversations, they would attend and say, oh, I never knew I could learn this being a part, if I was around or if I attended an ERG an ERG meeting with the LGBT group. So it really opened up a different conversation when we had those smaller focus groups. And so I do encourage anyone, doesn't matter how large or small your organization is, to, try to do something along the lines of that.
And we do a lot of
Absolutely.
collaboration, so that there isn't you go to this for the African Americans, you can come. Matter of fact, one of the main committees we have in our African American ERG is a white woman that helps to lead it. And so it's very common for us to have kind of cross, so that people are seeing that you can be an active member in any ERG. You can be a male and the female, as well as we have our African American population is large, obviously, for our ERG. But we have everyone that attends. We have leaders that are not African American as well, because we're trying to show that it's just those that have a common interest to support, not that you have to necessarily have that exact identity. I think that has been really important as well to see that.
Yep. Very great. This is a lot of great points. Real quickly, I'm just a time check. We got about 17 minutes left. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We do have one more question, and Nichelle, if you can hang on for 1 sec. That we'll ask. And then something that was just brought to my attention, just to make sure that we're talking about race here, this whole conversation kind of revolves around that. But let's not forget that IDEAL does encapsulate, race, gender identity, age, LGBTQ, et cetera. So all of these basic tenets, we should always apply to those different areas too. And I think we'd be remiss to not mention that, this just doesn't revolve around race, that this does apply to those other areas and those other elements. So that being said, you had something to say, Nichelle?
I was just saying Allison's last comments and everybody's actually really ties into the future panel on allyship. So,
yep, most definitely.
Important to communicate across the organization how people can be allies.
No, most definitely. And this, the notion that you don't have to be a woman, I think it's very important that men are very vocal and stand up and show that they are advocates of that. So that is something that we'll touch upon in the next roundtables. And thank you for bringing that up, because I'm excited about tackling that topic. So time check. We have one more question. I'll throw it over to Yvonne, and then obviously we'll open it up to the other folks. If you're on the phone and if you have other questions and want to add comments before we sign off here, since I have everyone on the phone right now, before you exit the webinar, make sure to do that survey, because it does help us identify what topics and if you like this format, et cetera. So the next question, or the last question here, with 2020 in the rearview mirror and considering the challenges ahead of us this year in 2021, we've got a new administration. There's still some political vitriol that I hope just kind of gets washed out. We still have COVID-19. All these tough topics. What should, the operative word is should, the priorities be to successfully establish and or optimize, because we've got different groups, some that have a strategy already in place they should optimize and some that don't have one. What should the priorities be this year? Yvonne, if you could take that, and then we'll add some other comments from the other folks.
Yeah, great question. I think I would just build off of the last point you were just making. This isn't a conversation about race or gender or sexual orientation or identity. This is or abilities. This is a conversation about belonging. So when organizations create a space that allows everyone to show up every day as their best self, everybody wins. There's greater performance, there's greater innovation, it's a more interesting place to be, there's stronger sense of community, there are, of course, performance and financial results. And more, boards are starting to have more conversations and ask more questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're seeing more boards, another ESG, that's another acronym that's being thrown around in case people don't know about it, but it's, environmental, social, and government, which are some standards that are addressed and discussed at the board level, and people are increasingly seeing that D&I plays a space in each of those. So I think what I think we're going to see, and what we're already seeing, and oh, by the way, and there was great legislation, or I should say an executive order around equity signed just yesterday. So you're seeing this real movement towards this being a much more strategic conversation at the board level, which will trickle down throughout the entire organization. And I think Allison brought this point in early on too. You've got new talent coming in that's making this table stakes. And I think Catalyst and some others have done some great studies that have said that like 57% of the interviewers are looking at are your board, is your board diverse? Is your leadership team diverse? So, this is not just becoming something, and for that person with only 30 people or an organization with 30,000 people, this isn't just a conversation about, race or ethnicity or whatever the case may be. This is a conversation about creating a space where everybody wants to be.
And to your point, real quickly, Yvonne, just last year, we've all experienced it, and I think just a few of us have gone back to the office. We're all remote. So this is sort of it's not a rhetorical question. I'm asking the group here, has the remote workforce or the necessity to have people work at home, has that helped or hindered what Yvonne just said? And how does that impact the strategy when you have to think about, will people be going back to the office physically, or will you have to contend with the dynamics and the complexities of people working at home where you're not in front of them?
Sal, I personally think it helps us. You okay, Michelle? Okay. I personally think it helps us in a lot of ways, because my hope is that it will allow us to include people who maybe traditionally, because of geographics, we wouldn't have been considered before. And so now it's very difficult to tell people, I'm not going to consider that person because they live here or X, when you've literally had people home for a year and a half. We're going to have to really make that case differently to folks, number one. Number two, I'm a firm believer in that stories change hearts. And there were people who I have known and who I'd worked with for years. And when the dialogues that occurred over the summer, people had no clue the level of baggage that I had in my many years of work. People were shocked to hear that I had been called the N-word at work before from someone, or that the level of what it took to get to work and some of the circumstances that I had endured over my 25-year HR career. I've had an executive use a racial slur at me before. But all they knew was the Allison that kind of brings that person to work, not the personal pain. And so there were a lot of people that maybe felt a very strong way about diversity, that after they'd worked, oh, you experienced that? They maybe associated that with certain folks. And so I believe that the Zoom environment provided people to have dialogues in a very different way, because we were saying it in someone's kitchen. We were seeing their cat go across the screen. We were seeing their children pop up. It's interesting. In some ways, it's created another level of community, because, I'm having this dialogue, but I'm seeing Kim's beautiful background, and her pictures of her kids, and now I'm interested in who they are, And so I think while there are some downsides, we need touch, we need to see each other face to face, we're going to need to find the compromise. I think that this has shown us that we can work differently and maybe connect differently as well.
Yep. And to your point, for a lot of folks, who are reluctant to articulate or convey what they think, working from home and being able to communicate that either virtually or via an email or what have you, or one-on-one via Zoom. They may say things that they may not have otherwise had they been in a group or in front of someone. So I think that's a great point, that they allows them to be a little bit more relaxed about it. And another thing before I forget, all of you have implied this, but we all think about the warm fuzzies of endorsing and establishing an ideal environment, but we also have to look back at the business aspect of it, the ROI of what those efforts will impact or how it impacts. I think we all kind of have to draw it back to that. Not only that it's the right thing to do, obviously, but just also that how it impacts the company and how we can propel the company forward in that manner. So we're about 10 minutes or 9 minutes. I know everybody's probably terribly hungry, especially on the East Coast. Any questions? I don't know if we have any more questions, Brett, from the audience. This has obviously
go ahead. We have enough questions to fill the next 2 hours if you want to go down that path.
Oh, what we'll do is that those questions, I promise every one of you that have stayed on, and even if you had to drop off, Tina had to drop off. Darn PepsiCo has all those meetings, so she's busy and had to drop off. But thank you to her. For those of you that have asked questions, we will get an answer to you. I've already asked the panel. I will be sending them the questions, and then they will be answering them. Give them a little bit of grace. They do have their day jobs to contend with, but we will get answers to you. This is the intent, is for you to get it straight from these folks. And I highly encourage, kept saying this at the beginning, but go reach out to Kim, to Nichelle, Yvonne, Tina, Randy, Dean, Allison. Reach out to them via LinkedIn. Reach out to me and Brett, obviously. So any other questions, comments? These folks are experts in their field. They all have different perspectives. I hope that everyone here gleaned some useful information and reassured those folks that have created one and are not quite sure if that's the right path. You can always recalibrate. You can kind of hit reset. For those of you starting, I think all of these folks have established it's okay. You just get started. And as Dean eloquently put it, you kind of run the show now, and you can be a trailblazer. So any questions, lasting parts? Does anyone here on the panel want to share anything exciting that they're doing? Doesn't necessarily have to be within ID&E, but just Dean, I'll kind of throw you under the bus, so to speak. You have a new consultancy, I believe, that you should talk about real quickly.
No, well, thanks so much, Sal, for first of all having me, and thanks for even mentioning that. Over the last couple of years, actually, I've been doing consulting, but ever since the death of George Floyd, there's just been a lot of requests to help companies strategize, plan, and support their D&I efforts, plus doing education and training. And so I did open up my own consultancy called Stracity. It's a play on words. It means strategic diversity. And we're helping out companies. And if there's any way that I can support, one thing too is if you check out our website, Stracity, STRASITY.com, you could sign up to our newsletter where I'm kind of giving fresh information, insights every month to people about what's happening in the scene. So would love to connect with anyone that's on. Thanks for asking.
Of course, Dean. I know Kim. Kim is the D&I consultant, but she is what I call in transformation. She's part of my in transformation group, senior level HR folks who are in transition. I call it in transformation. So I've known Kim now for a couple of years now. If she's sharp, as obviously you could tell here, if you are interested in connecting with her, please do. Yvonne recently left as head of human resources at Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute. She's starting her own, she's hanging her own shingle, so to speak, as well. So reach out to Yvonne. Nichelle was my gracious first guest at my virtual fireside chat. I'll have another one. In fact, Yvonne introduced me to my next special guest, which will revolve around allyship. Allison and I have known each other for quite a while too. So if there are no other questions, on behalf of HRQ, myself, Brett, the audience, thank you, panelists, for spending your afternoon with us and your continued support to advance the dialogue of an ideal society. Until next time, I'm Sal Vergara with HRQ. Elevate yourself and those around you.
Thanks, Sal.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great learning from everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.